Hi, folks. You and maybe your portfolio too are probably tired of hearing this, but the age of AI agents has so far been a thorn on Indian IT side. Its business model is getting stale with each passing day, with each LLM upgrade. But what we often don't understand is what this means for the day-to-day nitty-gritties of the industry. There might be a possibility that Indian IT or parts of it might just adapt to this new paradigm. But what does such adaptation even look like? What are the forms of inertia that they will have to overcome to successfully change themselves? And even if they do adapt, will they be able to defend their new business from the new threats that AI will inevitably give birth to? To answer these questions, we had a nuanced conversation with Ameya Pimpalgaonkar, a storied professional with 2 decades of experience in the global IT industry, working across giants like IBM, Accenture, and Infosys. He has donned many hats, from software developer to CTO and co-founder of his own startup. He's also a prolific technology investor in both public and private markets and is very well known on X for his investing takes. Please note that this is an audio-only conversation. With that, let's get on with the show. The first question I had for you was sort of around, so like in recent earnings calls, you're like sort of finally seeing a lot of the signals that people said would indicate AI adoption on some level. The move from headcount-based billing to sort of outcome-based pricing, even though that's not happening as quick as anybody would imagine, that's still happening. And a lot of new revenue lines seem to be opening up that Indian IT firms are jumping into. But even if all of that happens, what is the moat that any of these companies, especially the biggest four companies, sort of even have? Like, what do they have any sort of defensibility in any of these new revenue lines that AI is opening up for them?
The shift from what you talked just about, that it's moving from the headcount based to the outcome based pricing, the shift is, I would say, it's very subtle. That discussion is coming out in the boardrooms, but it's not that very clear when actually the employee engagements happen, right? And until recently, if you look at AI, it was primarily a kind of a cost story, right? Like, for example, we are going to use AI to improve our margin. That used to be a kind of a common theme across the boardroom discussions. But in my view, what has changed in last 2 quarters, or even probably last 3, 4 quarters, is that you are hearing a revenue touch coming into that discussion now. And top tier companies, and they all have started to book something called as AI-led transformation deals as a separate revenue category. If you look at the cloud paradigm, especially after the COVID, lot of companies kind of recategorize their ongoing deals with the customer. They recategorize them into the digital revenue. How did they do the categorization? Nobody knows. On what basis they did that? Nobody knows, right? Just some client moving from an on-prem getting into a cloud, nothing changes. You start calling that a cloud revenue. That's not a true and quality representation of a cloud revenue, right? The cloud transformation, which actually brings value, which brings more revenue, which leads to companies' expansion of pocket share at a given account, that transformation looks very different, right? You do not just go from on-prem to cloud and start calling it a different revenue stream. So that's a very typical narrative that so many companies usually do, right? But what is happening is we have to focus on what are the structural signals and not these marketing kind of ones. And most of these, in my view, are still time and material engagements with an AI wrapper around it. The model hasn't changed much. What's changed is label on the invoice, in my view, at this moment, right? But the real shift that we were talking about, the outcome based pricing, and this is very interesting aspect because lot of customers are now asking questions very differently. Earlier questions used to be that, okay, I want to do this. How long is going to take? What is your TNM strategy is like? What is the duration like, and so on, right? There used to be benchmarks. Like, for example, if you are in a multi-country rollout, your first payment could come when the pilot goes live and the hypercare on around pilot is finished. Your second payment comes when the, let's say, next 10 set of countries go live. And the final payment comes when the final set of countries go live, right? So the benchmark based payment was always there. Even if it was a TNM story, the benchmark based payment was always there. So the shift in the discussion and the question is that now, okay, we will go live with you, no doubt about it. But the kind of money that we spend in maintaining the systems after we have gone live, what can you do differently to reduce that cost significantly so that I can operate with a very lean org structure, very lean vendor structure? What can you do differently at that point, right? And this is exactly where the outcome based pricing is now coming out, because the outcome based pricing requires the vendor, and vendor mean the IT companies here, to absorb the delivery risk. That's the biggest point, right? Until now, the delivery risk was in a way covered because it was time and material basis. Even if there is a delay, there was always a possibility to raise a new change request and cover for things that you have missed. But now that's not the situation. Since it's outcome based, you have to bear the risk on your own books. And that's a significant shift the way these companies were doing business, right? And Indian IT's entire operational model is built on de-risking the delivery through the headcount elasticity, if I would say in that manner. So, how would you de-risk? You would add, let's say, you are not able to deliver that with just two people, add five more, right? So the headcount elasticity was the way to de-risk that delivery. But that is now changing. You add people when the scope grows. You can't do that when you have sold, let's say, a fixed outcome at a fixed price, right?
Understood. Yeah.
Now, as we transition from headcount to outcome, in my view, it is rather slow than how it appears. It is being discussed very actively in social media, also is discussed in all the client discussions, but actual transition is, in my view, is going to be a little slow for next year or so. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First, like I said, the contractual challenges. All the service level agreements are still tied to a response time and not to a business outcome. So if you go to Jira, if you go to any of the ticketing tool like ServiceNow, you would clearly see the the SLAs as per the category of an incident. And the SLA translates into in how many hours should that incident be resolved. And whenever that time has elapsed, you start getting the escalation emails. So escalation happens automatically. But if you see inherently, this is still tied to a response time. This is not tied to a quality of a fix that a person is delivering. So there is no connection to the business outcome defined yet. And what this means is you have to renegotiate that contract, which is already a legal document. It's already kind of a time-tested relationship with a customer. How would you define a business outcome? That's the biggest point right now. Second, the internal profit and loss structures, right? And these companies usually measure utilizations, billable hours per engineer and revenue per head count and all that. Now, outcome pricing blows up that matrix entirely. And you would need to rebuild how the delivery units are measured. What is your new unit of measure? And how are we incentivizing that, and how is it that getting reported? Analysts know that they are going to ask question to companies that, now the outcome based pricing is coming, but they don't know how to measure it. And in my view, that is still at least a couple of year internal transformation, and it's not just a pricing change. And the most important is client readiness. But eventually, in my 20 years of career, what I've seen is whatever is the scope of work that you do initially in the first year, or even let's say first 6 months with the customer engagement, that always balloons 4 to 5 times compared to the initial SOW. So what you end up delivering is, I think, 4 to 5 times more than what is defined in the SOW.
And that's, I'm assuming, where the delivery risk also sort of falls in place.
Correct, exactly. So since most of the enterprise customers cannot define what success and what closure looks like in the early phases of SOW definition, that's what I mean by client readiness. So the transition is definitely real, but it will happen eventually. It will happen deal by deal, and it will probably not happen as a wave. And then you were talking about new revenue lines and where exactly the opportunity lies for these companies. So there are two clear revenue lines, and one we see already TCS is taking that approach, right? So they are going the AI factory or a cloud service or a data center side, right? They are building their own AI infrastructure plays, and their intent is to basically become the managed AI ops layer enterprise, and for the customers who do not want a hyperscaler dependency. So the margin profiles are different, but they are relatively stickier. That is one aspect, one revenue line which is opening up, and we see the precedence with TCS's approach entering into the data center. Second approach I would like to talk about is, now if you look at the 90s IT boom and what happened after that in next 15-20 years is, and let's call that paradigm as a legacy software paradigm. Okay, let's divide this into two categories. Legacy software is anything pre-LLM, and the new software is anything post-LLM. So if you look at the pre-LLM era, all the legacy software had a very specifically defined playbook. There would be a software OEM like Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, anybody like that. So they would control the enterprise software space. What would happen is they would sell a license, a perpetual license, multi-million license deal. Then to customize that, to make it a bespoke and working for a given customer in a given business domain, in a given industry with all their custom processes, you would need software integrators. You would need Infosys of the world's, TCS of the world's. So that was a paradigm. So you had enterprise software OEMs, there were legacy OEMs, and then you have legacy software integrators. Now you translate exact that into today's parlance. You have LLM who are taking place of legacy software OEMs, right? Claude is launching new service every now and then. They are getting deeper into enterprise and so on, right? Lot of these LLMs also have an association with legacy software providers so that they can penetrate the enterprise space. Okay. Now, what is the definition of SI here then? The people will say that, okay, LLMs eventually will be get built, but the application layer is still serviced by India. I agree. I mean, that is probably one of the most easiest proxy that anybody can talk about. But the most important and value accretive proxy that very few are talking about is the LLM factualities. So how it transitions. So LLM comes into picture. It is trained on a generic set of data. It is able to generate, and there is a cutoff on data set until what date that LLM is trained on. So anything that comes after that, you need a tool to do a web search, right? So anything that is not there in the LLM history and a training data, it performs a web search and tries to fetch an information. In a way, it is doing a RAG. But the point is, you cannot improve LLM hallucination and factuality just by doing RAG. Your cost will balloon. What you need is the reinforced learning of the existing LLM on a very specific domain set of data. So when you need that, what exactly is required? So you have a generic LLM which is pre-trained, but what you have to do here is you have to do reinforced learning again to fit that LLM into a certain industry, certain domain. Wipro has gotten into that. They have about 13,000 data annoters already on their payroll. And what these people are doing is they are taking a baseline LLM and they are creating reinforced learning workflows for all the LLM OEMs. And Wipro is just one example. There are other companies in the private space also who are doing this for STEM. There is a company called as Scale AI at the global level. There is a company in India called iMerit. And then there are more companies which will eventually come and do an IPO and all that as well. Preparation of the data pipeline and reinforcement learning workflows. That is something where the next alpha lies for all these companies. Why? Because all these IT companies, they have data which is anonymized, which is pseudonymized over last 20 years or even more than that. That data is properly stored and structured so that no personal information can be attached. No customer aspect can be attached. The data is anonymized and pseudonymized. Any data that is anonymized and pseudonymized is perfectly suited to be transformed. So the data label richness creation, right? So you have to label it, the data. So for example, a surgeon sees an X-ray and says, okay, there is a nodule there in the chest. So this line by a surgeon is actually an annotation labeling that data. And if you just pass that X-ray to an AI would say, okay, this is this is that. But it's still missing that surgeon's label, surgeon's context to interpret what it means. So that data labeling, in my view, is going to be one of the easiest and the quickest revenue streams opening up in near time for many of these companies. And what exactly it means is you take the models with pre-trained weights, you bring in the domain experts from all sorts of domains like legal, geography and STEM and all that. And then you tell them, you must have experienced this whenever you use ChatGPT, for example, and you ask a very strategic question. Sometimes it generates two outputs and it asks you which output do you prefer. That's exactly in a way ChatGPT doing reinforced learning to identify what do you prefer. So now think about doing exactly that at an LLM level, at an enterprise level. And in my view, Indian IT has the workforce and of course the muscle to do this. It's not glamorous, but it's real revenue.
It's real revenue. Right.
Exactly.
Is this also, I mean, I might be wrong because I doubt they have that kind of like human muscle, but like, is this also something that Palantir does? Like, in the defense industry, so to speak.
Sorry, can you come again, please?
Like this entire approach that you've described, right? Like where what you need is reinforced learning on a domain specific set of data, right? I don't know whether Palantir has data annotators on their payroll, but I'm assuming this reinforced learning is something that they do for, say, the Pentagon.
For defense.
For defense, yes.
Yes, of course. I mean, they have to have, right? So see here, divide the companies who are protected by defense boundaries because they cannot really go to external vendors. They need to have internal team. They have to hire people. But at this same time, I see from my interactions with a lot of startups who are operating within the defense as a space, what they do is they onboard quite a lot of retired army generals, navy senior folks, and then they use their expertise to do the data labeling. I see that's happening already. In India, it is happening. I see that there will be another line of businesses and companies coming out from that space. So it all starts with a very basic thing that, okay, I will be your data annotator, I will label your data. But eventually, after a point in time, it is still kind of a newer version of BPO. The real value comes in when you build a platform around it in multilingual, multimodal manner. If you build a platform around it, then eventually you will get into a situation where every single LLM is reliant on you before they release a newer version of LLM. So if you reach that space, that's where the sticky value and significantly high margin space exists.
So would you, I mean, not that I know what the platform I'm going to name are going to do, because I don't know what an Infosys Topaz does. I don't also know what a Wipro AI 360 does. Is there marketed as agentic AI platforms? I don't really understand. Like, I don't know if they're a collection of agents or whether they're the kind of platform that you are talking about. Like, what would your understanding be of these attempts?
See, the Topaz, I would say it's more of a branding umbrella rather than a single product. Like it's a mix of multiple products, and it was, I think, announced in 2022 or 23, I believe. So what it does is it wraps together a host of various AI services, AI tools, accelerators, and also partnership under one label called as Infosys Topaz. Now, if you think of it as, it's not really a software platform in my view. It's more of a go-to-market organizational approach that the company has come up with. What actually inside it is, I think there are multiple layers. First is, of course, the service layer, and service layer by mean is absolutely consulting and implementation services for enterprise AI adoption. That is first, and it's still largely people-led, just relabeled as AI first service layer. Then comes the Cobalt, right? So the Topaz product architecture wise sits on the top of Cobalt, and Cobalt is there basically cloud platform play. So the pitch is cloud modernization plus AI activation, combined both. And then there are certain pre-built AI accelerators, which are like very industry specific templates and workflows for BFSI, retail manufacturing. And these are meant to reduce basically your time to deploy for very commonly defined AI use cases. These are real use cases, but these are not very deeply proprietary in my view. And then comes the partnership ecosystem, where you have a very heavy co-branding with, for example, NVIDIA and Microsoft and all that, right? So Topaz, in a way, is partly a vehicle to resell and integrate hyperscaler AI capabilities with Infosys delivered wrapper around it. That is how I would anticipate or perceive that. So when all IT companies are talking about a bundled product, this is exactly how it is. It is layered product. It is not really just one platform that you would plug and start using it tomorrow. It has a service layer, it has a platform layer, it has a tools and accelerator layer, and it also has a partnership ecosystem attached to it.
Got it. One question that I think it was a tweet of yours that I saw where I also accounted for the first time, right? You differentiated between large cap Indian IT's pyramid shaped organizational structures versus, say, sort of more smaller companies having a diamond shaped structure. How important do you think this organizational sort of pyramid or structure plays in, like, when it comes to AI? Or rather, how much of this organizational structure presents inertia when it comes to AI adoption?
See, there are two things here. The pyramid structure is where the primarily Indian IT was built with. It's a very classic pyramid, a lot of junior engineers at the base, very thin middle management, and even thinner senior layer at the top. And this was perfectly designed for a scenario of labor arbitrage. Right? And the model was very simple: hire in bulk at the base, bill at a markup price, use senior people to manage client relationships and escalations. That's it. Okay, so the pyramid was basically intended to drive more margin. and higher utilization at the bottom level. So this was basically the decompose of what pyramid way of delivery looks like. Now, what is happening is that with AI, it impacts the base of that pyramid. The junior analysts, the junior developers, or QA testers, or let's say certain reporting analysts, and so on. These are exactly the roles that at least people are claiming that it's going to be replaced by the AI agents in the first wave. When what happens is when the base really shrinks, the whole margin and math goes for a toss. But the bigger problem, as you correctly said, that this also, the pyramid structure creates an inertia. I totally agree with you, right? Every senior person at the top was at a base at one point in time, right? The entire career contract inside these firms is like you start at the bottom, then you grind through the projects, get promoted, and then the pyramid over 8 to 12, 15, 20 years. This doesn't happen with AI anymore, in my view. But also the challenge here is if the junior roles disappear, where do the future seniors come from?
Correct.
So that question, we still do not have a very clean answer to that yet. Even I don't have that answer yet. And what happens is now if you leave these IT companies, top big 4, 5, 6 out, and you look at smaller companies who have always been operating at a much more leaner org structure, they are much better suited to make use of this. One reason is because they do not have overhead. So there is no risk of just, going out and firing people and creating a ruckus in the market. What they can do is they can increase productivity of the existing investors by even more. And I know that for the fact that it's happening. So what people are doing, the smaller companies, it's much easier to adopt, for example, cloud. And then the companies are now starting to convert their product features into markdown files. Every product pipeline or a product backlog, or whenever you do PI planning, for example, that gets translated into the outcome of that is a markdown file today, which goes directly into your cloud or whatever the coding copilot that you're using. And what happens after that is it becomes so easier to build a feature once you have everything defined in markdown file. Correct?
Yeah.
So in my view, smaller companies are much better prepared to benefit out of this, because just to get access to a co-pilot at a top 4 or top tier 5 companies, it's a nightmare. Now coming back to the inertia and the org structure that you talked about, the diamond structure assumes couple of things in my view. First is the junior work is largely going to be automated. Then it also assumes that the value creation is in the judgment and not in the execution. And that's very important point. And when I say that value creation is in judgment, that means you are valuing your mid and senior level more than you are valuing the execution layer, which is made up of most of junior folks. And eventually that ties back us to the selling the outcome and not the hours. So when we get into the diamond shape org structure, your approach is going to be outcome based and not hours based. And the biggest challenge in my view is you can't flip the pyramid overnight. And let's not even talk about overnight. You can't even flip that over a year or so. TCS, 600 odd thousand employees, Infosys, 300 odd employees. You just can't reskill the, let's say, even 100,000 or 200,000 of those junior engineers into a mid-level AI solution designers. And when people and companies are saying that we have AI-ready workforce, it's nothing but an internal training that is done. They don't understand the basic nitty-gritties around LLM. They don't understand how important it is to provide a context. People just start chatting in a natural language with a copilot and end up burning out their entire token quota. They don't understand how important is it to build context not only through prompts but through other approaches as well. What is a different chunking strategies and how it impacts your cost. But you see, eventually it all ties down to a cost. When you are in a customer engagement and you are selling an AI solution, if you do not know what is going to hit your costs, what are your cost breakdowns, you are not going to sell that. You are not going to win that contract. As simple as that. So I think these are some inertias in my view, but I think the inertia, it's not technological. Huh? I mean, it's much more than that.
It's much more than that, yeah. I mean, it rarely is, in my view, it's rarely technological. I mean, yeah, it's interesting that you talk about sort of like, because one of the questions that I had was, I listened to a podcast on the Ken, where this gentleman, entrepreneur named Sidhu Ponappa, he's also running an IT services firm in the AI age, but he seems to be doing pretty well. He had said that of all these companies, like for example, now you have Infosys signing a deal with Anthropic, HCL as a deal with OpenAI, right? And these are most likely software procurement deals where the goal is to roll out Claude to the rest of the enterprise, right? And again, like you said, they'll all be sandboxed. But the analogy that Sidhu had sort of put is that, like, it is not enough for you to procure the best model available at any given point of time, because the best model is very likely to change in the next week, or even the next day for that matter. The only way to sort of survive is to build an operating system with which you sort of work, where you have an idea of how flexible you can be. Like you said, right? Like, you don't know what task works best for Codex. You don't know what task works for Cloud Code. Then how could you ever aim to be, flexible, or have an operating system by which you'll say that, oh, this is my AI native strategy, so to speak. So, like, I mean, the question that I had, I mean, which I think you've already answered, is that, like, how much in Infosys signing with Anthropic really matters as like a signal? Like, but I'm assuming I think you've already answered this question to some degree.
Right, right. So, see, the point is, in the way I read it is, it's very important that these enterprise companies announce these deals, because they have taken so much flack right now of not doing anything and all that, right? So, but in my view, these deals hardly mean anything. Even if you release Cloud Code or Codex or anything internally to your employees, these tools are good to build a POC or a pilot or something. But when you are actually going to take that to production, that journey is very different. The compliance and the governance side, the legal aspect on the customer side. And most of the customers of these Indian IT are from Europe and US. And they have very strong legal boundaries defined around usage of AI and what you are shipping in production. So you just cannot just code, do a QA with AI and ship something in production. That's just not possible to be achieved, right? So in my view, all these deals are good. They are all narrative building. They are giving access to their people so that they can start building something, because that's also an important aspect. Unless you build something, you will not get to know what to do and what not to do, how to structure your cloud better, how to ensure that you don't burn tokens too much. And this is very typical scenario every time it happens. So if you are building with Cloud Code, for example, and you every time you chat with the co-pilot and you ask, I want to build this, and then you have a session and session gets completed, and after session is completed, Cloud Code usually compresses the session, so that it can refer for the next interaction. And then you come back the next day and you start asking question that, hey, I don't think this is working. So the co-pilot will go through all of your files, entire project structure. That's a waste of time. So unless you have access to Cloud Code and do mistakes, and then you figure out that, every time I'm interacting, I'm burning 100,000 tokens. Why is it that? How can I improve that? All that learning is going to come out of these deals and these associations.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So this is how I read it. These deals are not intended to ship code faster to production, in my view, or we are not there yet. It's like letting your employees understand how to use Cloud Code, how to use Codex, how to code better, how to structure your project better, how to ensure that you do versioning better, how do you ensure that you do not consume token when it is not necessary, how you build on, go on building context, how you organize your cloud.md better, how you create more markdown files, how you create a governance and let's say a naming convention at a project level. So all those kind of hands-on dirty learning that every engineer goes through, right, in the initial year, I think these deals are going to be enabled for that. That is how I'm reading it at the moment. Not for enterprise customer, not to ship your product much faster, not for anything else.
But you have to make the mistake first.
Exactly, exactly. So these companies are willing to do that, and I think it's a positive thing, rather than calling them out that, this deal is not going to result into any top line. But top line just doesn't come like that. You have to improve and transition with what new customers are demanding, right? So you have to reskill. So I think this is all a reskill initiative, and eventually something good will come out of this, in my view.
Makes sense. That's a more optimistic frame than what I've heard elsewhere. One question that I had, or rather, this is a somewhat of a twofold question, is sort of how does AI change things around go-to-market, right? Because obviously historically you've always had a salesperson or a sales team that would go to a client, talk to a client, they would work a demo with them. That demo would take a while, right, to build, obviously. And then you show them the demo, and then after a while, after like months, the client decides, oh, you know what, we're going to sign a contract with you, the systems integrator, right? But now there is a possibility that, say, your salesperson is somebody who can build a working demo of something you want in the call itself, like right here in front of you. Doesn't necessarily have to know a lot of code, but like if the goal is to build like a simple CRM, so to speak, they can do it, right? Some companies already seem to be doing this exact thing. So like, what's your view on sort of how client relationships might be changing in sort of the AI age? And obviously, how the second fold question is, how do these client relationships change for large cap companies versus say smaller mid cap companies?
Ah, that's even interesting aspect. Okay, so my answer is twofold. If you are within an enterprise client category, I don't think that's an easy task for a sales guy to just go and build a demo and show something to the customer. We all know that, see, I'll tell you the reality. Within enterprise or any IT company, the delivery guys hate sales guys because they always overpromise. They promise something which is technically not possible to be built, and even if it is possible to be built, it's not possible to be built in the time that sales guys commit, right? So I have been in that, not just in Indian IT, even in the product companies where forward deployment engineers, they always sulk on the sales guys because they go and overpromise. They say that our product can do this, our product can do that, but in reality there is just no feature available at the base layer where you can architect or orchestrate that function, right? It's not possible. What you have to do is you have to raise a patch note to your core engineering team who can build the foundation, and then you build a feature on top of that. This is the reality of the world which we live in.
Makes sense. Yeah.
All the respect to sales guys because they bring in the revenues and contracts, but there is a tad disconnect in terms of understanding the capability that is possible to be delivered in the productive environment compared to the capability that you need to show in a demo to get a contract. There is a very stark difference in between these two, right? And what is going to happen definitely is delivery is going to get faster and deeper. I'm not denying that. But expecting a sales guy to code a CRM while being in a customer meeting, I think this is a little bit of
Like, you're not expecting this to happen anytime soon, actually, at least.
a bit too much of a stretch. At least in enterprise space, I don't think that will happen. Outside of the enterprise space, probably where the sales cycles are much shorter. For a reason, they are shorter because their goal and what they're trying to achieve through the business process is entirely different. So in that case, probably it's possible. But in my view, it's not a very realistic scenario for at least next year or so, wherein you have a sales guy sitting in a meeting and then adjusting a demo here and there, and then just going out and winning a contract. I still think the sales cycles are not technology driven. They are driven by intangibles. Your delivery quality, what happens after the delivery. And in the age of AI, the importance of audit trail is something that we can't even start to describe. So I was in a call yesterday in a company, and they were just discussing that they had an incident where they had an army of agents and 3 agents did not agree to what rest of the agents concluded, and the system just froze there. And the product had no way to determine in such case how would you conclude, who has the veto, who says now okay this is it. Even the orchestrator agent was not able to come out of this state. So system just froze there, and it froze even when the product had a capability that if agents disagree, do this, do that, whatever it is. Agents were self-aware. Even then it happened. So we are still discovering newer and newer aspect of working with these tools. You need a human coming and sitting in and doing the dirty work. And then do you have that human who understands this? If you have already fired people, who is it that you're going to send? Well, it sounds so flashy, right? I mean, that we have a solopreneur and all those things. But eventually we will get there. But right now we are not there. And in enterprise, what sells is your relationship, the plumbing around the technology. Technology seldom sells. What you're going to do with that technology, how are you going to assist a customer in a situation of dire need? How are you going to manage something that is completely unpredictable and something uncertain? How are you going to address a very peculiar way with working with a regulator, local regulator, compliance, data boundaries? How are you going to address these kind of things? It's become even more challenging in the world of AI. Imagine a situation where you have a productive environment going on and suddenly some screenshot is taken and sent to an agent, right? And what if that information leaks outside? Who is going to take the ownership of that? Who is going to take the ownership if agent takes a wrong decision? So we still don't know answers to these questions yet, right? So in my view, the sales cycle and the GTM is not going to massively change around the decision making, but where it's going to change is your proposal generation is largely going to be automated. The 40-page proposal that you used to take solution architect probably a week, right? Now, probably that's going to be done in a day, right? Because you already have pricing tables, you already have a boilerplate, all the case studies, right? And you know the customer, what customer is looking for. So probably the 40-page proposal that used to take another week, you can generate that probably in 3-4 hours. And then you can send that to a solution architect and ask him to evaluate it and correct it wherever needed, so that you don't hallucinate through that process, right? So these things are going to be definitely going to improve. Certain pockets within the GTM are going to get expedited. You used to go from a prospect then to qualified lead, and then there was a discovery session, like you correctly said. Then there used to be a solution design, then the demo of the solution design, then proposal, then legal, and then close. That used to be the cycle, right? So of that, in my view, the prospect, the first phase is going to be very, very expedited. And legal also, because there are a lot of legal startups are now coming in within the AI space, where the LLM is able to draft your initial version of document, and then you pass that on to the senior advisors, who then review it and then pass it on.
So like you're saying that it'll still be, at least for the foreseeable future, relationship driven as it always has been.
In fact, it gets even more important when you are selling an agentic AI system. Selling a trust become even more important. That if something goes rogue tomorrow, I am there. I will ensure that nothing happens. So that becomes even more important now. So that's why the relationships are even more important.
And you're saying this is true for large and small companies equally.
Yes, everywhere. So the accountability becomes the relationship. That's what my understanding is.
And I'm assuming this will be even truer for sectors like banks, which obviously have heavy-handed regulation.
Also, it's especially with banks and fintechs, due to the compliance regulatory laws and all that, they can't just switch vendor at their will. And also, it's very important to understand that you cannot whitewash everything with AI. If something is working well, if something is very stable and working without AI, why just go and wrap it up around AI? You don't really have to do that. I mean, I understand you are trying to identify process inefficiencies, process bottlenecks, and so on, but you cannot improve a banking workflow beyond a point. The regulatory bottlenecks, the compliance bottlenecks, or you call them bottlenecks, but they are created for a reason, to protect a common man, to protect the infrastructure and protect the government and our digital sovereignty, right? We cannot afford to have susceptibilities created and shipped into production, especially when we don't understand how this whole system actually works. You must have seen what happened at McKinsey, right? Recently.
What happened?
So at McKinsey, there was a cyber attack, and the attacker was able to access about 700,000 documents, including millions of chats, chat logs, and systems which required no authentication. There was no authentication in place.
At McKinsey.
Yes, at McKinsey, there was no authentication in place. And they also found some places where SQL injection was possible. They did that. And you know what is the time and the cost? 2 hours and $20. That's what attacker, it costed attacker to do all this thing. And this is a classic example of why you cannot just go heavy on AI just to make noise and support your stock price. Because eventually something will come and bite you.
That'll be fun. Awesome. Great. You touched upon digital sovereignty, which I think like is sort of also a fairly nice point to close on. Is we've seen, like, at least in earnings calls, we've seen deals that were made. And it's probably reflective of sort of the nature of where the world's headed today, where every country is sort of prioritizing their own sort of national security, so to speak, right? Like Middle Eastern companies are now building data centers because they have the money, and they don't really want dependency on, say, a hyperscaler, right? You've written a blog on digital sovereignty, how Indian banks are particularly looking at it, and how IT companies are looking at it, right? Like, so where do you see AI and digital sovereignty colliding? Where do you see AI and digital sovereignty gelling together? Like, if I had to put it that way, if they gel together at all.
No, definitely. I mean, they gel together, especially in the banking and fintech parlance. They definitely gel together, especially at the customer experience level, customer onboarding, customer experience, all those levels, they definitely gel together. Where they don't gel together is the layer in between the infrastructure, especially, for example, the identity management, the privilege management, right? Basically, things that are protecting your core and critical systems. That's where it collides. In my view, it doesn't really gel. And that's why it's in, especially, and you correctly said, in 2026, it's very important to understand what national sovereignty is all about. I mean, so much of that critical part of the infrastructure is still controlled by Western companies. And I know that for a fact that there is a push from government to find a domestic player and replace it if it's possible. So in my view, wherever it is edge case, customer experience, reaching out to customer much more faster, understanding how customer is using your product, building more and better product based on customer sentiment and all that, analyzing customers trend and all that, all these things AI gels fantastically. But where it is not going to gel is the interconnect between the two systems, two completely heterogeneous systems, where you have custom integrators built to make these systems talk with each other. So if that is the case, then AI definitely cannot gel there. You need a very, very stable integrator, that integration approach that is working, especially with your security, your authorizations, ensuring that, your tokens, authorization tokens do not last long beyond the point after a handshake between the two systems. So these kind of spaces is where I don't think AI is going to gel that really well.
Right, makes sense. And are you like, because obviously you've probably read the Citrini report. I have read your thoughts on the Citrini report. Are you worried at all about India's technological comparative advantage eroding? Like, is that something that you are worried will happen in the AI age, or are you like far more confident about, oh, India can build service and product companies in when it comes to software? So, for context, I'll give you more context as well. So, we had another podcast guest, like this was a proper live podcast. He'd come into office. His name is a policy maker named Pranay Kotasthane, and he was of the opinion that even though individual firms might fail, India's tech sovereignty will remain intact because you will have a lot of smaller players sort of figure out a way.
I am definitely optimistic. There is no question about it. And I engage with quite a lot of startups and new age companies that are building something natively out of India. See, today it's so easy to go to US and say, we are building something, and we see so many Indian guys building something but out of US, right? It's easy to get US premium. It's very easy to raise funds and so on. But the people who are doing this out of India, out of sheer love of building something at our own home for our own people, right? That is something needs to be appreciated, and that's happening. So that's why it makes me very optimistic. And I keep on saying that India's tech canvas, which was primarily dominated by Infosys, TCS, and handful of product companies, is going to drastically change over the next 5 years. Drastically, right? We will see companies coming up who are technologically at par, if not better, delivery-wise much, much cheaper, right? And much easier to build a feature in for a customer, right? So all these things are going to happen, and all this is happening with an India discount, right? So I do not agree with Citrini's report in any of the way. One thing which I agree is the volume play is definitely gone, right? So you hire 50,000 engineers a year or 5,000 engineers a year and run them through 6 months of training, deploy them on a maintenance and testing project initially. That model is now broken in my view. And it's not threatened, it's absolutely broken now. So that is why where the change is, and this entire thing is going to bring about quite a lot of change. The nature of jobs are changing. We are not going to probably see transition. Whenever transition happens, there is certain job loss. I'm not denying that. But transition happens for a good. Like I talked about the data labeling, data annotation, data pipeline and data preparation workflows we just talked about, right? Prompt engineering, that itself is going to be a dedicated role within an industry. Someone who understands supply chain and logistics deeply, who has been a functional consultant for last 10, 15, 20 years, understands process so well, that person is well suited to create generic prompts that can be stored into prompt registry, and that prompt registry can be sold as a baseline feature to customer, right? So you do not have junior developers coming in and writing prompts at their will, which will burn out your tokens, right? So I see quite a lot of new roles coming up as well. And if you want to judge India on her technical sovereign capabilities, you should not look at the listed universe. You should look elsewhere where people are actually hands down building something. And that is very encouraging, very encouraging. These industries will create more jobs, more roles. I'll just give one more shorter context if you won't mind.
Yeah, of course, I would not mind it.
See, what happened is, there was a parlance of old money. Old money is something which was, I would say, before 2015, right? So that old money was very stable. It chased FD, it chased 12% ROI and all that, right? And if you look at the new money now, it's like it chases innovation. It doesn't chases quarter to quarter analysis. It chases what are you building. It chases what is the R&D spend, right? And what happened is that it wasn't possible for that old money to be transitioned into new money just like that. What happened is the owner of those old money, when they grew old and they passed their inheritance to the newer generation or our first generation entrepreneur, especially Sachin Bansal, Binny Bansal, or even the Kamath brothers, for example, right? Dipinder and all that. So all these people who, in my view, are the first generation entrepreneur of the new money scenario. They started building something in that phase 2015 or even prior to that. And over a period of time, they built companies, they achieved scale. Whoever the initial investors were, they gave them exit, right? Zomato got listed also. And it created quite a lot of capital for them to go and invest something into completely revolutionary. We are seeing what Dipinder is doing right now. So what happens is when these things happen over a period of time, and it happened over a period of decades, it doesn't happen just like that. It happens over a period of decades. When the old money transitions into new money, when the risk capital is available, more and more startups get funded, right? And it is so important that such capital is available today, so that at least you try out if something will work or not. Earlier, what used to happen is people used to take decision based on your top line, your bottom line, your projection. So eventually, whether to fund a certain thing or not used to happen on Excel sheet. So now that is changing, and that's why I'm very, very hopeful. And while the market is actually listed market is crashing, I think there hasn't been an exciting time like today if you look at the startup ecosystem. So I'm very positive, very upbeat on India, and India changing the skin now from here onwards. We have turned the page.
Nice. Just one last question, if you don't mind, because it's sort of a theme that's sort of come across in the entire chat we've had so far. And it's also partly why we started covering large cap and mid cap IT separately, is because domain specialization is something that you've talked about throughout this chat. Like at the very start, right now, like even with how you talked about reinforced learning, you've mentioned that domain data is going to hold a lot of importance, right? Palantir is a domain specialized AI player, so to speak, right? Like, do you think domain specialization is like going to be like a defining sort of mode for Indian IT companies going forward?
Of course, I think not just for Indian IT, but in general Indian businesses as well. And that's what I've been doing for last couple of days. I've been posting a series of Substack where I'm talking about India data mode. So, and I have held this opinion for quite a long time that, given India's diverse footprint, our cultural diversity, the kind of data that we have generated across depth and breadth is so humongous, not just in the consumer side, but also through Indian IT, the kind of work that we have done for the Western clients, we still hold significant amount of anonymized and pseudonymized data structures. We don't hold the actual data. You don't really have to hold the actual data, and it's not legal to hold the actual data as well once your assignment is complete. But the learnings from that data, how the data structure look like, right? So that is still with us. And in my view, that is why domain specialization matters even more today. And see, what we talked about is we talked about pyramid and we talked about execution and so on, right? So the old pyramid erodes because the execution gets automated. We talked about that. We talked about outcome-based pricing and then the accountability, the importance of accountability. We talked about the sovereign AI requires the local experts, the domain experts, the client relationships shifting from capability to accountability. In my view, the domain specialization is answer in a way to all these things. So the company that deeply understand, just for an example, a company that deeply understand the trade of the trick, or trick of the trade, sorry, and not just the technology, but the regulatory nuance, the exception handling, the relationship between, let's say, letter of credit and underlying commercial transaction, or what happens when a shipment is delayed and let's say a bank needs to make a call, right? So such firms can build solutions around this, which in my view, anybody just out of nowhere cannot come and build that and replicate quickly, because the knowledge that is required to build it right, not just build it right, And it's not there in any training data set that's globally just available that these companies will go and just start building. That's why you see all the products which are coming up, all the startups which are coming up. I don't see any startup coming up within the enterprise AI space.
That was our conversation with Ameya Pimpalgaonkar. We hope you enjoyed it. I certainly took away plenty from it and came out a little wiser. We will be hosting more conversations with professionals across industries and disciplines soon. Until next time.